Hello and welcome. This is Poohead189, and today I'm going to be talking about the basics of classical Greek civilization. It will be the first video in a series I will make concerning various Greek city-states, and I wanted to give a broad overview of what we would call Greek history and the polis. I decided I would put my history major and my years of study to good use and branch off from my fantasy lore videos, though don't worry, there's plenty more on the way. Okay, so, the Greek race, or ethnicity, quote-unquote, or the people who we know as Greeks, were not always native to the region of Greece. Before they arrived, there were various native Bronze Age peoples, the greatest of which was the Minoan Civilization, a kingdom that lived off the island of Knossos or Knossos and controlled a vast sea trade in the Aegean. The Minoans were named such for their king, Minos, the first king of Crete from Greek legend, said to be the son of Zeus and Europa. Historians are not entirely sure if Minos is one king or if it was a family name for many, though Thucydides says he was the first king of the peninsula, so at least he says there was one king. The Minoans did not speak a Greek language, nor were they technically related to Greeks, but the later Greeks would take much of their arts and culture from the Minoans. Those that are said to be ethnically Greek are theorized to have come from the Balkans around the year 1900 BC, gradually moving down the Greek peninsula and subjugating the people living on the mainland. These ethnic Greek descendants brought the language and the main body of people to the land. By 1600 BC, they and the native peoples had come together and interbred, and had created the Mycenaean, otherwise known as the Achaean, civilization. Over a dozen petty kingdoms ruled by warlords appeared among the mountains and valleys of Greece. By what we can tell, they were a martial people, using chariots as their main form of military power, like most Bronze Age civilizations, and citadels rose up among the landscape. For the time, the citadels would be huge structures, but to us they would be fairly humble. Medieval castles would take a good 10 to 20 minutes to walk around, but these citadels it would take about 2 to 3 minutes. And in 1400 BC, they would overthrow and level the Minoan civilization, meaning the Achaean civilization. And in 1400 BC, the Mycenaean civilization would overthrow and level the Minoan civilization, whose culture they adopted, taking over the old sea routes. If you're still a bit confused, the heroes and kings of the Iliad and the Trojan War would be the Mycenaean Warlords, as the term Mycenaean is in a reference to Mycenae, the largest and leading kingdom ruled by King Agamemnon. As you might have theorized, there were civil wars all over Greece at this point, and at some point between 1300 and 1200 BC, there was an uneasy peace within mainland Greece in order to fight a city off the shores of Asia Minor, next to the Hittite Empire, that we know of today as Troy. Other than that, we know very little about the Mycenaean kingdoms other than the fact that they fell during the Bronze Age collapse, as most civilizations did, in one of the greatest mysteries of history. Many scholars have tried to theorize what caused the Bronze Age collapse. Some say tectonic activity, others volcanoes, others disease, and some others claim it was a vast migration of new peoples. The Mycenaean palaces, where most of the scribes and writing were collected, along with all of the literate people, were torched and destroyed. By who? We don't know. But they were sacked by someone, we know that much. The Greeks will claim it was the invasion of the Dorians, the descendants of Heracles or the Roman Hercules, who arrived into the peninsula and whose descendants formed a few future city-states, most notably Sparta. After the collapse, for a period between 1150 BC to 750 BC, we know very little, and we call that the Greek Dark Age. They had no real written word, and the previous government and institutions of the civilization had collapsed, meaning the various kingdoms. And while the rest of the Mediterranean world and the Near East had neighbors to at least share in their struggles, the Greeks were largely left to their own devices due to the Aegean Sea and the Balkans to the north. Around 750 BC, the Greeks came back into the scene in what we call their Archaic Age, and around that time, much of what we would call the polis or Greek city-state had either been developed or were in development. Now, why would the Greeks develop scattered cities rather than a unified kingdom like most other areas? Well, the geography of Greece is about 85% mountainous, with only a small bit of arable land, and the rest of the land is valleys and shrub filled with hinterland. Open trade that wasn't on the sea would be hard, as would be connecting the peoples that grouped together, and initially the populations were far too small to ever be called kingdoms or even fiefs. So the people of Greece, while they had a wider unity, were isolated in day-to-day life often, and towns were formed, which in turn created city-states. Many of them were ruled by tyrants initially, and those that didn't usually had to deal with tyrants at some point. However, unlike kings, the tyrants hardly ever passed power to their heirs, as the people wouldn't have it. The whole point of a tyrant would be a member of the citizen body who rigged the system to give them more power, but at the end of the day, they were still a part of that system. They still had to merely claim, "Oh, I'm simply the first citizen," as many of the would-be tyrants of Rome would claim. So most of the tyrants were overthrown eventually, or ruled until the day they died, and then either another tyrant would take their place with a new set of rules, or the people would rule. Eventually, constitutions were made, and the Greeks developed city-states, basing many policies after the oral traditions that had been passed down from the Iliad. Not because there were constitutions in the Iliad, but based on how the heroes and characters had formed councils, and how Agamemnon called the army to assembly, how Odysseus was admired for his ability to persuade, and how military service and martial skill were valued. While I think there is room for debate on this thesis, Aristotle wrote in his memoirs notes on the types of city-states and how they were formed. They were separated into aristocracies, oligarchies, and democracies, which I will discuss in a moment. It's also something to note that no matter what government was made, there were aristocrats in about every city-state, and they held a sort of divine providence which gave their families a claim to some kind of power or influence. They were called the koloi kagathoi, meaning the good and the beautiful. Good looks were seen as a blessing by the gods, which is why they added beautiful, though of course not every noble was good-looking, just a side note, but I digress. Aristocracies were formed on cavalry power, something in classic Greece you saw very little of. I'll explain that in a Greek warfare video, but during the Dark Age they were fairly prominent. The aristocracies were much like the feudal states of medieval Europe. These lords had the money and influence to afford a horse and good arms, and fought as the flanking attackers in their army of lesser-equipped infantry. Essentially, they chose the horse because 1, they could afford it, and 2, they wouldn't be doing a lot of hard fighting because Greek cavalry was not really used much, other than to chase down fleeing enemies. An oligarchy, as most know, is a government based on who has the money. In Greek civilization, however, an oligarchy was a government formed by the landed classes, or men who owned bits of land. These landowners would be the ones allowed to vote in the assembly, and when there was an oligarchy, there were hoplites, or it was based on hoplite power. Most Greek city-states had hoplites, whether they were an oligarchy, an aristocracy, or a democracy. But oligarchies' main fighting force were the hoplites, because every landowning citizen had the money to buy their own basic arms, and they owed the city military service. Sparta, while still somewhat of an oddity to the Greek mindset since they still had kings, was an oligarchy. It has an aristocratic class of older men in what we call a gerousia, who discussed and passed matters that were voted in the assembly, but at the end of the day, the assembly was made up of hoplites, which were the citizen body of Sparta, or those male citizens who owned land. Democracies came later, Athens being the first in 510 BC, and they were developed where sea power was used, because while a navy needed skilled oarsmen, and make no mistake, they needed to be skilled citizens, you would not need to own any land or arms to learn how to row. And that means that every oarsman and marine paid military service by rowing, and since they were each paid their debt to society by joining the navy, many people could vote in the assembly, so they tended to become democracies. Also, a side note, Marines were actually hoplites that joined the triremes in battle, so just letting you know that those men did need to afford arms. As you can see, much of what makes someone a citizen is tied to military service. Showcasing the Greeks at least saved some of that military ethos from their predecessors. Oftentimes, the aristocrats were in what we called councils or boules in Greek. In oligarchies, the landed classes would vote in the assemblies and the councils might have veto powers, or they might provide a checks and balances system. In the Athenian democracy, the aristocrats in the council often held power by the will of the people, and guided the assembly rather than directly controlling it. They held their powers by oratory and convincing the assemblies to do thus. They were pretty much the models for politicians, and though the assemblies held the democratic power, most generals and orators were statesmen and aristocrats because they were well educated and they were recognizable figures within the city, essentially celebrities. And of course, they were the koloi kagathoi, or the good and the beautiful. As long as they respected the democratic system and the assembly, they would be respected in turn. Many of the most famous leaders of Athens, like Pericles or Alcibiades, were aristocrats or came from wealthy families to begin with. The Greeks were notorious in the ancient world for being far more difficult as subjects than as allies, because of their fierce adherence to a polis with a free constitution that bred a stubborn independence in them that made it extremely difficult for even a very lenient king to rule over them. Something King Darius and later Xerxes of Persia would discover when they controlled the Greek city-states in the shores of Asia Minor, which led to the Ionian Revolt, the conflict that set the Persian Wars in motion. I'll make a video detailing that at some point, but the Persian Wars shifted Greek civilization from their archaic age to their classical age, and there was no major changes in architecture or culture, but an enhanced Greek identity, and the rise of Athens in opposition to Sparta, as well as the slow spreading of Greek culture. And though there was no major changes in architecture or culture, there was an enhanced Greek identity, and the rise of Athens in opposition to Sparta, as well as the slow spreading of Greek culture. Though to be fair, many other kingdoms acknowledged Greeks and respected the power of Greek gods even before Thermopylae. King Croesus of Lydia, who ruled the Lydian kingdom beside the Persian Empire in the 6th century BC, traveled to Greece to ask the oracle at Delphi if he would succeed in conquering Persia. Furthermore, the Greeks were also very congenial, and one could say respectful friends of one of the oldest and richest civilizations in the Mediterranean world, the Egyptians, who they believe worshipped the same gods as they, only they were in different guises according to the legends. Greeks were revered for their textiles, their pottery and art, their philosophers and statesmen, for many exiled statesmen of Greece found service in Persia or Egypt because they were hailed as being incredible, but above all for their hoplite mercenaries. Many Greek city-states knew that their heavy infantry was sought after by various states of antiquity and sold their spears, so to say, across Asia Minor and the Aegean. To kill two birds with one stone and demonstrate 2 points at once, when Alexander the Great invaded Persia, it was said that there were more Greeks fighting for the great king of Persia than there were in the so-called Greek army of Alexander the Great, because Alexander the Great sought to rule Greece, which was in contrast to Greek autonomy, and the great king of Persia knew the value and loyalty of Greek mercenaries, so he used that and had somewhere around thrice as many Greeks in one of the battles. Alexander the Great's army was made up of Macedonians, Balkan peoples, and the Greeks of mainland Greece made up about a third of his army, which was about 45 to 50,000 strong, for his full army. Off topic, but still. Anyway. So, that's all I had to say about Greek civilization today. I'll delve into deeper topics soon, but as of now, I hope you all have a lovely day and stay tuned for more videos. Thanks, guys.